Today's subject is going to catch a lot of you off guard. I have on the line with me right now David Good, son of Kenneth Good, a renowned anthropologist who years ago worked with the little-known Yanomami tribe deep in the rainforest of Venezuela. Working under his colleague Napoleon Chagnon, Kenneth was assigned the task of collecting data for a few months. But as destiny would have it, that stay with the Yanomami continued for 12 years. This wouldn't be such an extraordinary feat had there been the creature comforts of modern society. But the reality is, until that time, the Yanomami had been an isolated people for thousands of years, having little or no contact with civilization. And I'm so excited to be talking now with his son, David. As an interesting segue, David's part American, part Yanomami. Like his father, he's been working with the tribe, but has taken his father's work one step further. Not only is he documenting how the Yanomami live, he's set up an organization that's protecting them from the dangers of outside society that would seek to exploit them. So David, we give a hearty welcome, and thanks so much for coming on with us today.
Hello, thank you, Dan. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here.
David, after having done my research about your mixed heritage and your family's unlikely itinerary, I found that you've spent a lot of your life in New Jersey, and the same holds true for me, so I feel this natural kinship with you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I spent a lot of my early childhood in Rutherford, New Jersey.
So, David, I know that the audience is a little puzzled with how I introduced you. Let's start at the beginning so you can give us a little clarification about your background.
Sure, yeah. It's a very long, convoluted story, but I'll try to sort of compress it for the audience. So basically, in the mid 1970s, or 1975 to be exact, my dad was a graduate student at Penn State University, studying anthropology. So he went on an expedition into the southern eastern Venezuela in the Amazon rainforest to live among the Yanomami tribe for 15 months. And he was tasked to measure protein intake and how that was related to warfare. Um, and he had worked under his director, Napoleon Chagnon, and Chagnon had tasked him to go deep into the deeper parts of the territory to stay among a village called the Hasapuateri. And he stayed among the Hasapuateri for 15 months measuring protein intake, but he found something that he wasn't quite expecting. You know, he read, of course, through his in his studies and ethnographies, he can intellectualize who the Yanomami are. During the mid 20th century, they're known as a people that had relatively little to no contact with the outside world. They have no written language. They have no calendar. They don't count beyond two, so their counting system is one, two, and many. And technologically speaking, they sort of are stuck in the, quote unquote Stone Age, where they never really advanced past stone axes and stone tools until the introduction of steel goods from the Spaniards. So my dad, when he was down there, had sort of gotten a snapshot of what life was like hundreds of years ago, maybe even thousands of years ago among the Yanomami. And he found living with them, he what he describes as the essence of what it is to be a human. You know, he was free from the worries and the strife of this modern Western civilized world. And what was supposed to be a 15-month research program ended up being a 12-year-long stint in the Amazon rainforest.
Wow. So the Yanomami had continued for thousands of years, and paradoxically, in a way of life that was standing still. And your father must have been a really determined person because he chose to leave his old life behind and assimilate. But 12 years is a long time. Why did he stay so long?
Well, life in the jungle is hard, but it's simpler in a way where you don't have to worry about all these stresses that tax the psyche of us, living in this Western world. So you don't have to worry about taxes and bills and dates, and you're not bound by numbers or calendar. To him, he felt like he was just getting down to his basic, roots of what it is to be a human being, and he found that among the Yanomami. And he just fell in love with the culture and just became enamored with their lifestyle. Everything you have, everything you consume is extracted straight from the forest. All the tools you need to build a house, to acquire fish and game. The men go out and hunt, and the women go and gather, and it's a very simple lifestyle compared to us. And my dad just sort of fell in love with that. And of course, he eventually learned the language. He moved into their Shabano, which is their sort of roundhouse structure, which the Yanomami reside in, and learned the language and just became part of the culture. And then, so one day, the headman approached my father and said, "You're one of us now. You're Yanomama. You can speak like us, and just like any other Yanomama, you should have a wife." And of course, my father kind of laughed it off because he thought, how could a Westerner like him, an anthropologist like him, accept such an offer? But the headman insisted, and my dad finally agreed, sort of lightheartedly agreed to it, thinking that it would just never amount to anything because the Yanomami, they engage in what's called a betrothal system. They betroth a girl, or there's an intent to marry. It's kind of a loose term, it could, the betrothals come and go, marriages come and go. So he thought this would just be something that would just sort of die out, so to speak. But as the years went by, he developed a friendship with Yarima.
That's the name of your mother, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I guess I blew the whole surprise for everyone. Sorry about that.
Yeah. No. No. It's okay. Yeah. It's good to make that clarification because then sometimes people can't follow it. But yeah. So Yarima was betrothed to my father, and Yarima means windy day because my mother was born on a windy day, so she was nicknamed Yarima. So they developed a friendship, and then as the years went by, she matured into a Yanomama woman, and this friendship soon turned into a romance, and then they eventually married according to Yanomama customs. However, my father now has a foot in both worlds. So, he periodically has to leave the territory to renew permits and visas, to publish, to, present data and so forth. And him leaving the territory caused a strain on the relationship. So he had decided that perhaps it would be a good idea for my mother, Yarima, to come with him, to go with my father to the outside world so that they could always be together. And that's what happened. So with a few stepping stones in between, they ended up in Rutherford, New Jersey, and started a Yanomami American family and had 3 kids.
And you were the first one, correct?
I was the firstborn, yep, and I have a younger brother and a younger sister. So that's basically how it happened, and we just became a Yanomami American family.
Okay, so I myself was born and bred in New Jersey, and what's popping in my head right now is a landscape of what your town might have looked like. I'm looking at rows of upscale houses, strong commerce, a lot of expensive cars. I can picture you, your father, and your 2 younger siblings, and your mother, who hasn't had much experience living in modern society. Just being there must have caused a lot of strain for her.
Yeah, so if you look at it from my mother's perspective, she had been born and raised in the Amazon jungle, and as far as she knows, before she left, she thought the whole world was the Amazon jungle. She just thought that she was just going to another part of the jungle where my father had lived. And so for her, you can almost liken it to going in a time machine and fast forwarding in 2,000 years. And you can imagine just everything was novel, new to her, to the technology, the language, the culture, the people. And along the way, she stumbled a bit, but what's amazing is the adaptability of the human mind. My mom was really adapted rather readily while she was up here. She kind of soaked everything in, and a lot of it probably because the novelty of it, the fact that you can control light with a little stick on the wall, with the light switch, it just absolutely amazed her. And the abundance of food and so forth. And my father would tell me stories about how my mom would get angry when he would ask her, "What would you like to eat for dinner?" And because that question, that concept is not part of their conceptual framework in the Yanomama mind. What would you like to eat for dinner? Like, what do you mean? We just eat. There's food, there's no pantries in the jungle where you can just open up the cabinets and just pick from spaghetti to soup or whatever. And, it almost would be like, oh, do you want to take a ride to the mall or something? And then you would ask someone, oh, do you want to wear shoes or not wear shoes? We would look, it would be a silly question to you. It's like, of course we wear shoes. It's what we do. But for her, to be given options to eat dinner was just very strange. So at first, and I could imagine it was tough for her, but she did, she had a family and she adapted rather readily. However, the only thing that she couldn't cope with was the fact that she was isolated so far away from her Amazonian family because there's no means of communicating with them. You can't email them or call them or even send them a letter or anything because they reside so deep in the jungle. So that was some of the issues growing up with the first 5 years of my life with mom, and because the only person she could really talk to was my dad, and of course my dad was a different person up here than he was in the jungle because he had to go get a job. You have to work. You have to put food on the table, get a roof over your head, and those are all things that my mother just didn't understand. This part of this Western world, this in currency. You need to. There's this little piece of paper that you give to people, and then these people give you goods and food, and so that was kind of tough for her for a while.
Speaking of learning how to use currency, did your father ever trust her with a credit card? I know a lot of men don't, even when their wives are American.
Yeah, my mother picked up really quickly that there's this little shiny plastic thing that you give to the cashier, and they do this weird thing where they just swipe it in a machine and then they give you goods. And so she caught on pretty quickly, and she would tell my dad, oh, just go use your plastic thing to get stuff. And she didn't understand, credit and value and money. But, my dad used to give her $20 every day so that she could go for a walk and go to Dunkin' Donuts and go to a store, maybe buy something. And she didn't know what $20 was really, what that meant. All she knew was that she had a piece of paper. She'd give that paper to somebody. She would get maybe her T-shirt or whatever she wanted to buy, or her donut. And then that person would return other pieces of paper with some coins. So that was the only thing that was going through my mom's mind.
So basically, your father was spending lots of time at work while your mother was alone, and she was getting frustrated because all they needed to live were those slips of paper.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much, because he felt bad. He understood there's this Amazonian jungle woman that's trying to make it in the streets of New Jersey. So, and it's not like this was what he had envisioned for us, but it's just in the meantime, he had to do something. He had to find something, and that's what happened. And unfortunately, we just sort of got holed up for a while in New Jersey, and then years had gone by before my mom had been back to the jungle, before we had been back to the jungle.
You definitely have an interesting background, you and your whole family. And I think I can empathize with what you went through because I was raised in the U.S. but spent a lot of my adulthood in Japan. And the problem was I became Japanese but didn't know it because it happened so slowly. After years of assimilating and trying to be successful and living with them, I started acting like them, and I even lost a lot of my English ability. And when it came time for me to return to the States and get a job, it was torture because I would look people in the eyes like a Japanese guy would. I wasn't a Caucasian anymore.
Right.
And job interviews would flop, of course. I can remember trying to get my car fixed, and I was speaking to the mechanic like I was a child. It just didn't work. So I know the kind of stress that accompanies coming to a new place. And for me, it wasn't even as bad as your mother because I had been born and raised in the U.S. Your mother, on the other hand, was a Yanomami, and I understand that there was a time when things got really difficult, and she finally decided that the jungle was her home.
Yeah, yeah. So that same sort of emotional, psychological struggle that you had dealt with, similar to what my mom had dealt with, and my dad was kind of desperate for a while to try to get back down to the jungle. He had always envisioned sort of living down in Venezuela or in the jungle, sort of going in and out of the territory. He didn't really envision this life in America, but unfortunately, those were the cards that we were dealt with. But we had an opportunity, a financial opportunity, to return down there from National Geographic. So National Geographic had expressed interest in doing a documentary on a homecoming. It surrounds us as a family and our return visit to our village, to our Yanomami village. And in turn, they were going to cover all the costs of the expedition. And these aren't cheap trips, you know. There's my dad had to consider the dangers of bringing three little kids into the most remote parts of the Amazon rainforest. So, medicines and vaccinations and safety equipment and so forth were all in order. And fortunately, you know, National Geographic covered all of that. However, because it had been so many years since my mother had been down there, you know, she had missed a lot. She had missed funerals of very close relatives, and she had missed her mom's funeral. And so it was very upsetting for her. And because the nature of the trip was to do a documentary, we were only going to be down there for 5 days. So we had to return back to the United States after the documentary was finished. And then we made a return trip. And it was on that return trip where things were getting pretty bad, and my mother couldn't handle it anymore. She couldn't cope with being up here in New Jersey, you know, and there's many reasons why she couldn't, but a couple is that here in this world, when you wake up alone, isolated from your family. You wake up with these four walls and a roof, and your eyes can't see far, and your kids are in a different room. And for her, she thought that was not the way humans are meant to live. For her, when you wake up in the jungle, you can see as far as the eye could see, and you wake up to sounds of your mother and your uncle and your brothers and your sisters and your cousins we're all together in this one village. And she felt very isolated and lonely up here. And unfortunately, mom couldn't take it anymore. She made the decision to separate from the family, and she was to remain in the Amazon rainforest. And my father and I and my siblings were to be raised here in the United States. And that was going to be the last time I would see my mother. I was 5 years old.
At face value, that might not seem very noble, but then again, it was noble because your mother knew that the jungle was her home, and children don't fare very well in the jungle. So maybe cutting off the relationship was more of an altruistic action because she was looking out after her children.
Yeah, you can put it that way. You can say that the infant mortality rate is much higher in the jungle, and you know, not that she's really thinking in terms of infant mortality, but she does understand that there's a much better chance of survival in the United States than in the Amazon rainforest. Who knows exactly what was going through her mind when she made that decision? But I think, you know, growing up, I internalized it as sort of abandonment from her, and there was no real closure because when she's in the jungle, there's no way I could call her, contact her, email or Skype or whatever. So I had spent all these years wondering why she had left. But of course, now that I'm older and I understand the Yanomama culture and so forth, and I have a better understanding of why she decided to leave. And so you know, in retrospect, I think it was for the better because she is a woman of the jungle. She was not meant to really live up here in the United States, and the jungle is her home.
You alluded to the fact that you felt a sense of abandonment after she made that difficult decision. Of course, there was the need for some closure to the situation because open wounds need to heal. And you decided that the best way for this to happen was to find your mother. What was the catalyst in your adult life that set you up for your journey back into the Amazon?
Yeah, so you could think of years upon years upon years of questioning and wondering who my mother is and who I am as my identity as a half Yanomami, and my culture and this other side of me that didn't really understand. And growing up here in the United States, you know, I was 100% culturally American. You know, I was born and raised here, and but then you know, I hear stories about my mother and this sort of exotic culture, the Yanomami, and that's not exactly something that I really wanted to be known for. Growing up as a teenager in the United States, I just wanted to be a typical American kid. So I sort of hid from that, and I also dealt with some identity issues and coping with my heritage and indigenous background. And it wasn't until in my early 20s where I was still dealing with this sort of identity crisis that I had, and I realized it all mounted to way back 20 years ago when I was 5 years old. You know, it's the provenance of all of this is my mom leaving. And I knew that if I really wanted to continue on in my life, I knew that I had to confront this issue and I had to dig back 20 years and really understand what really happened with mom when she left us when I was 5 years old. And that's what I did in my early 20s. And as soon as I got to understand through stories and reading articles and speaking to my father, I had a better grasp of who I was as a Yanomama. And I decided that, okay, I accept my heritage, I accept who I am. And now I just have this innate yearning to go find my mother. And so in 2011, after I graduated from college, I decided to embark on this journey to go to the Amazon to find and reunite my mom.
Was it an easy task trying to find your mother in the jungle?
No, no. In the family, it was the big surprise that I was the one that wanted to go down there because I had spent all these years hiding from it. So I did this complete 180, and now I'm trying to go towards my heritage. And so I had a lot of obstacles along the way. I had a big fear of bugs
Uh-oh.
growing up. And so my family, they're a bit worried. And I said, how are you going to survive the Amazon if you're afraid of a ladybug? So and that's very true. I have no outdoor experience. At the time, I didn't speak any Spanish. I spoke no Yanomami. So it was really daunting. But I decided, you know what? I have one mission and one goal in mind. And if I just focus on that goal, on that mission to go down and find my mom, I was pretty confident that whatever obstacle that came my way, I would be able to overcome it. And I would be able to compartmentalize any fears that I had as long as I stayed focused on my mission. So that was sort of the driving force in getting from the United States to Haspuateri, Amazon.
I understand that after contacting different people and meeting a very pivotal person in particular, you were able to find your mother. What was it like when you first saw her after all those years?
Yeah. I teamed up with a Venezuelan anthropologist, Hortensia Caballero. And so she and we took a long boat ride about 3 days from a town called Samariapo to get to my village, and with some pit stops along the way. And we had a lot of help from Catholic missionaries that are stationed in the territory. And so we were all in our boat, and we approached the riverbank, and the Yanomami, they can hear the motor from a mile away, and it's sort of this big commotion. Everyone starts yelling motor motor, and everyone gets excited because it's not too often they get visitors and this deep into the territory. So when we started drifting up to the riverbank, all these Yanomami were waiting for us along the river, and sort of scanning us and with these curious eyes. And of course, I'm nervous. This is my first and real initial exposure to Yanomami and this deep in the territory. And not only that, I'm looking at them and knowing that they're my family, they're my lineage. This is my bloodline. And so we arrived there to Hasapuateri, which is the village that my father had stayed for so long and where my mother's from. And we had found out that she was not in that village. She's part of a different village. However, a relative had dashed away into the rainforest to go get her. So we decided to set up camp. We pitched our hammock, and I waited for about an hour, hour and a half for my mom to arrive. So in the meantime, I had been sort of barraged with all these women and children. They all came to investigate me. I had never had so many hands all over my body. They were touching my nose, pulling my ear, touching my hair.
Just like a rock star, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And I was just thinking, whoa, this is like a scene out of a movie. And I always have to remind myself, it's not like I'm meeting this exotic people from a sort of an academic standpoint, from an anthropological standpoint, but I'm also meeting my relatives. Like, this is my family. And it's just so cool to see my family, an extended family, and to be so welcomed. And it was a great time. Of course, I was nervous and always laughing, and I didn't understand what they were saying. But then the hour and a half passed, and then my mom walked in. There was this sort of immediate hush around the village, and you can hear people whispering my mother's name, Yarima, Yarima. And so my mom, she had walked into the shabano. She was carrying a basket of yucca. So she lowered the basket. I got out of my hammock, and I had started to approach her. And then I had thought, oh man, what do I do? She's a Yanomama jungle woman, and I'm, an American kid. Everything in me just wanted to hold her and hug her, but that's not what they do in their culture. So I sort of found myself in this cross-cultural dilemma where I'm reuniting with my mother for the first time in 20 years, and I have no idea how to do it. So there was this sort of awkward moment where I stood up to her, and she started trembling and crying, and I see her face, and I recognized her right away, and she has those HEE sticks, which are small little sticks that pierce your lower lip and nasal septum, and I'm thinking, wow, this woman, I know this woman, I recognize her. And so I put my hand on her shoulder and I didn't know what to do. So I just started speaking English and I said, Mom, I made it.
Huh. It seems to me that you and your mother now have a budding relationship. After reuniting with your mother, I know that you've gone back to see her many times. When you're in the rainforest with her, what things does she teach you that a typical American mother wouldn't?
Yeah. So, life, as you know, is very different in the jungle. And when I return to the jungle, I always want to learn how to be more and more, Yanomama. So one thing that my mom is teaching me is language. The sort of funny thing about my position in the village is that she's a woman and I'm a man, and there are certain tasks that only men do and only women do. For example, only the women collect firewood, and only the women go crabbing, and only the men go hunting, and only the men plant plantain trees for their gardens. So because I have this budding relationship with my mom and I just want to be around her all the time, I found myself doing a lot of things that are outside of the social norm within the Yanomami village. So I would always tag along and I would help her collect firewood. I would go crabbing with her. And of course, that's sort of a unique thing in the village because here's a guy doing tasks that are meant for the women. But for me, it's more than just that. It's just hanging out with my mom. So I am learning things like collecting firewood, going crabbing, and what mushrooms to eat and so forth. And it's just learning how to survive in the jungle. And of course, I also have a brother down there, a half brother. So he's been monumental in really pairing up with me and teaching me other things like shooting a bow and arrow and hunting and chopping down trees and how to garden and so forth. So,
Well, the opposite is true too, because he's probably pestering you to come to the States and wanting to learn all about life here.
oh yeah, my brother really does want to come to the United States with me someday, and I'd like to do that for him. But I feel that I would need to have a better grasp of the knowledge and the language of Yanomami before I can bring him up here. But however, he has, like my mother, he has no idea what this outside world is like. And he sees me bringing down all these trade goods, pots, pans, machetes, clothes, hammocks, and so forth. And he wants to be part of that. And he wants to join me in my endeavors to helping the Yanomami in the village. But, he doesn't understand currency and money and what you need to do. And I try my best to explain to him that I need to work hard in the United States to be able to buy a ticket to Venezuela. And he said, it's okay. I'll come up here and I'll work in your gardens and I'll help you chop down trees and so forth. And it's just sort of that blissful ignorance, that innocence that he has. And I just sort of laughed. But maybe someday I'll be able to bring my brother up here and my mother.
You got to get up to snuff on that Yanomami language.
Yeah.
From what I understand, the Yanomami have felt some positive impact as well as really negative impact from exposure to outsiders. Before we get into the dramatic side, let's first talk about the positive.
Sure. One thing that I'd like to do as a Yanomami American is sort of give a better, accurate portrayal of who the Yanomami are today, the contemporary Yanomami. So yes, while it's true, remote villages such as mine and even others that are deeper in the jungle still live in their traditional culture that hasn't changed in hundreds and hundreds of years. However, in this day and age, the Yanomami are experiencing very dramatic culturation and change. So there's a dynamic of acculturation among the Yanomami. So you have Yanomami that are speaking Spanish. They understand politics. They actually have certain political seats within their territory, which is sort of interesting to think about, considering who the Yanomami were half a century ago. And you have Yanomami that are missionaries, have jobs, the ones that are further upriver, closer towards quote unquote modern civilization. But then as you get further and further away, you could see the change. And then when you get to my village, when you get past the Guajaripo Rapids, you see that Yanomami are not as acculturated as the ones further upriver. But what that means, on the positive side is that they're not like these subjects in a zoo. We can't just isolate them from the rest of the world. They have a choice to control their own destiny. So if they're going to be involved with the outside world, they need to understand Spanish and politics, and they engage in policy making, and that affects the whole tribe. So that's sort of a positive thing where the Yanomami are now controlling their own, or attempting to control their own destiny and sort of be part of the global market and the global world.
That's some progress in the right direction. And you mentioned something that I want to touch upon, which is they're not subjects in a zoo. So let me give you a scenario. Let's say the rainy season is coming and an outsider gives them ponchos. They're light, they keep the Yanomami dry and warm, but there's a big Coca-Cola insignia on the front. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Yeah. Um, well, I'm just imagining a Yanomami in a poncho, and I don't think that's a pretty funny sight. Because in the rainforest, but it depends on the gravity of the situation. Now, if Coca-Cola wants to come in there and start spreading their memorabilia everywhere to the point where it's affecting their social structure, then I have a problem. But Coca-Cola to a Yanomami really means nothing to them. They have no idea what it is. But now that you bring that up, there are products, not necessarily items like clothes, but other things like foods are being introduced to the Yanomami. And things like white flour, white sugar, white rice, even cigarettes, and so forth. And those are the kind of things that the Yanomami are being introduced to that not only affect them on an individual level with their health, but it really does affect their social structure where they become dependent on imported foods, and the youth are now forgetting how to garden, forgetting how to hunt, and so forth. And not only that, the shamans in the village are being undermined in their positions, and it just goes on and on and on. We can do a whole seminar on this, but those are some of the issues that I have with the influence of the outside world, where, like you said, people can innocently want to help the Yanomami. We have this Western notion of help. What is help? Our idea of help is giving things. We have this idea of poverty, and we usually measure in terms of material possessions or money. So we look at the Yanomami, oh, the poor, impoverished Yanomami. Let's help them by giving them food or giving them these things, but they don't understand the repercussions of introducing some of these Western items or concepts to the Yanomami.
Sure, out of goodwill we can try to do something helpful, but in the end make them worse off. Maybe that's why people like you are needed as mediators. I'd like to go into a little cul-de-sac here. In the beginning of the interview, I mentioned that I spent a lot of time in Japan, and it might be surprising to everyone that medical treatment there is second rate because of the bureaucracy of approving simple drugs. A big part of the Japanese population has athlete's foot, and they can't get rid of it. No matter what prescription they get from the doctor, it sticks with them for life.
Wow.
But if they simply fly to the U.S. and walk into a CVS or Walgreens, they can find the cure waiting for them on the shelf. I know this because I had athlete's foot for 3 years, and one day while I was back in the States, I found an over-the-counter ointment containing the drug butenofine, and in 7 days my athlete's foot was gone. So David, does this speak into the Yanomami situation?
Again, when I brought up that they're not subjects in a zoo, the Yanomami are portrayed as these sort of pristine people, but that's not necessarily true. They've been exposed to outsiders since the 1400s, as far as we know. And so they have been introduced to certain diseases like measles and tuberculosis and even the common cold, which can be fatal to them because they don't have the immunity against that. So the fact that we can help the Yanomami medically by giving them access to simple over-the-counter medicines that could better their quality of life, I'm for that. It's sort of a public health measure. It's an important field, especially in the field of medical anthropology, to understand the healthcare system of the Yanomami and the healthcare system of the outside world and sort of the interaction between the two.
David, you mentioned 3 diseases that are prevalent among the Yanomami, and I believe there's another, which is syphilis. Is that correct?
Yeah. To STDs in general, are going to spread more, and that's sort of an introduction of the Western world, and that's going to be a problem more so in the future now that there's an increasing frequency of migration of Yanomami from the jungle and moving to the city. And there you could find, I guess we can call them urban Yanomami, but you'll find, especially the girls, get involved with prostitution and alcohol, and the guys, get involved with drugs, and that's not the kind of change that we want for the Yanomami, because what happens is that they can contract these STDs and they go back to the jungle, to their village, and then you can guess what would happen there, and that's how diseases can be spread. So we want to respect the Yanomami wanting to change, but I think there's also a responsibility because we are fully aware of the type of changes that the Yanomami can be exposed to, the good and the bad. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that we serve as trustworthy mediators between the two worlds.
I read somewhere that there's a big problem with gold miners. Have they been a factor in spreading these STDs?
More so in Brazil, there are accounts of seeping into, Venezuela. And one thing we've got to mention in the beginning is that the Yanomami tribe spans between Venezuela and Brazil. In Brazil, they have a problem with garimpeiros, which are gold miners that illegally penetrate the territory and establish these mining camps, and through acts of violence and warfare have been really causing a lot of trouble for the Yanomami, and ranging from just outright murder to the spread of diseases and prostitution and alcoholism and so forth. So that is a very imminent problem that needs to be addressed, because it's just awful. Not only are they hurting the Yanomami physically, but they're also damaging the surrounding ecosystem by poisoning the waters with mercury and so forth. So that is a big problem, right now in Brazil, more so for the Yanomami. And I hope that the Brazilian government can step up the game and really kick these gold miners out.
David, when I was living in Colombia, I had to go to neighboring Ecuador to renew my visa. And when I was crossing over, a border guard stole from me. He did it openly, and he wasn't even ashamed about it.
Right.
And I found out that's
Yeah.
just how things are down there. So have you had similar experiences during your treks to see the Yanomami?
Um, yeah. So you learn very quickly the level of corruption, and sort of the blatant corruption is that's almost just as fascinating as the corruption itself, is how apparent they are with it, and there's no shame because it's sort of like just part of their culture. It's like bribery is not really bribery down there. You can't It's just sort of what you have to do.
It's just doing business.
Just everyday business. You got to bribe politicians, you got to bribe police officers, border guards.
Yeah.
And it's not even, you don't have to even be surreptitious about it. You just do it because that's just what they do. It's pretty funny, but I never really had any issue yet. I did become a victim of corruption on my last trip down there when I was doing a project with 60 Minutes, and they saw me and the CBS crew as a threat. And by they, I mean not the whole government, but certain factions of the Venezuelan government didn't like the fact that American journalists were going into a territory in which they had complete control, and they were afraid that we might expose something that would make them look bad. So they had all these falsified documents and made up all these crazy stories, these crazy lies, and and these were representatives of the government, and the blatant lies that they just sort of spat out. It was crazy. It was just ridiculous. I was sort of shocked. I didn't think that, yeah, I knew there was going to be corruption, but I didn't think it was going to be that outward and straightforward about it.
You were with these cameramen, and a lot of money was put into getting some great footage. I hope they got what they were looking for.
Yeah, well, eventually the project folded, so we only got as far as Puerto Ayacucho. We fought the good fight and we lost, and through the corruption and the lies, 60 Minutes was forced to turn around and go home. I always planned on going to the jungle under the radar, but now I sort of, I brought a whole 60 Minutes crew with me to do a project, and they had to go home, and now I'm like, oh man, I'm all by myself, and I'm not necessarily keeping things quiet anymore. So I had a lot of people they're always fishing for something, and I had people just sort of quote unquote check up on me, see what I'm doing, trying to spy on me and so forth. And
Wow.
Yeah, so
Well, that can actually be a stepping stone into better things because now you can go out and buy a GoPro video camera
mm,
and you can put together a bunch of videos to show people what's really happening inside the Amazon.
yeah.
So, David, when I was a kid, I hated the taste of coffee, and now as an adult, I can't live without it. I'm wondering if music is an acquired taste as well. For me as an American, I love listening to Lynyrd Skynyrd's Sweet Home Alabama. That's tops for me.
Yeah.
South Americans like the Gypsy Kings, and over in Europe, there's a strong following that listens to polkas. During the times that you've seen the Yanomami exposed to music, what kind do they like, if at all?
Yeah, so the ones that have access to, let's say, internet or could buy CDs, they like the general pop music that can be found in Venezuela. And I find that among the youth, they tend to emulate pop stars, and I see them sometimes, Yanomami, dressed in weird kind of ways. Weird to me because, the Yanomami that I know with my family are just sort of naked people in the jungle. And then, I see this youth as I go further away and closer to the mission that are listening to pop Spanish music. It could be Venezuelan rap or their typical pop music down there. I'm not sure exactly all the names of the genres, but yeah, they love outsider music. And I actually I brought my laptop to the village, my mom's village, and I played a little music for them on my laptop, and it was a pretty funny sight. There's about 20 Yanomami. We're all huddled around my laptop, and I played a little Michael Jackson for them, and they and they loved it. And I played it for my mom because when my mom was up here in the United States, some of her favorite bands were Michael Jackson, Gloria Estefan, and so forth. So it was pretty neat.
Sure. Well, what I fear is that one day you return to the jungle and see that they've already progressed to the extent that they're dressing like the 70s version of Michael Jackson or even Elvis.
Yeah.
We want to avoid that, okay? So that's why we need you as a mediator.
Right. Right.
Anyway, in grade school, we all learned that the American Indians settled there after having crossed the Bering Strait from Europe. I know how remote the Yanomami are, and I think, how could they have made such a trek? We know that there was a single Adam, as evidenced by the fact that any human on Earth can procreate with any other human and produce offspring. So, what are your thoughts on how the Yanomami arrived in the rainforest?
Yeah. So, I've read different theories, and of course, the most widely accepted and most popular theory is the Bering Strait Bridge, where from Eurasia, our ancestors had crossed the Bering Strait, and over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, eventually made their way all the way down to South America. And then as far as recently I mean like 3 or 4 or 500 years ago, the Yanomami were thought to be part of a larger tribe, and then when the Spaniards came, they might have been splintered or fractioned, and sort of settled into the highlands of what we call Parima, and eventually from the highlands they made their way down to the lowlands. So that is basically a general idea of where the Yanomami came from. So I don't really know, and being that I haven't done any in-depth anthropological studies on the archaeology or the history of native South Americans, but
Well, it seems to me like you've got a lot on your plate already without having to deal with every other anthropological plate out there. So I think it's an amazing thing that someone's found his life's calling. And I looked at your Facebook page at Join the Good Project and saw that you've started a nonprofit to go along with what you're doing.
sure, yeah. And you know what, Daniel, I find myself I had found myself sort of overexposing my nonprofit because it has been syndicated throughout the world with all these media outlets. So I'm getting people from all over the world, including Japan and Malaysia and China and even in Eastern Europe and so forth, saying they want to join my project. And so, which is a beautiful thing to have so many people involved. But so the Good Project has just recently received its 501c3 tax exempt status just a few weeks ago. So it's we were really at the incipients of our mission and our goals, and we have a lot of things to do. But we feel pretty confident that over the years we're going to grow and grow and get to a point where we can really truly serve in our mission as being a trustworthy bridge, a link between the traditional world and the encroaching influences of the outside world.
Have you noticed any drawbacks to starting a nonprofit? Or maybe it's too early for you to answer that.
Right, right. The drawbacks, well, when I came back, I had an idea and a vision, and I shared it with my peers and community. And running a nonprofit, you need to have a really, really good team, and you really need to have a good board. And sometimes it could take some time finding someone who shares your mission and shares your goals, because the board for a nonprofit, when you're starting out, can make or break your dream and your mission. So the drawbacks for me has been sort of the time that I needed to spend in finding the right people and finding the right team. And while that can hold me back in moving forward with the sort of the operations of the good project, but in the end, I'm very grateful that I didn't sort of rush into this. That I really truly found people to have on my team that are really willing to advance the mission and the goals of the project.
That's a really interesting point there. And I understand that during meetings you have to meet with board members. And for a lot of people in the audience, they're not at the level where they can gather others with the same goal in mind. A meeting for them would encompass sitting at their kitchen table with their dog and their goldfish. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you gather people and vet them to know they should be on your board?
Yeah, and the thing is, that's for every nonprofit, but mine specifically, I was the only Yanomami American. I'm the only one that has experience among the Yanomami, so that was sort of an issue that I had in trying to get people to understand at my level of some of the obstacles and goals and so forth of the project. But I participated in a seminar with Dr. Randall Pinkett at East Stroudsburg University. And something that really stuck out in my mind when he was giving his lecture was that whenever you're starting a business, and you look at some of the very successful businesses throughout the world, and there's never really just one person. It's usually a partnership or a team or something of some sort. And he told the audience that first, when you're starting a business, you got to find the who. You got to find the right team member. And that person may not even be able to spell anthropology, but but if you can work with them, and if they have in their hearts, share the same mission and dreams that you do, then as soon as you find the who, then the what will come into play. And then you'll figure out what it is that needs to happen, because now that you have a team member and you have another mind to sort of collaborate with and trying to come up with goals and missions, it makes your job a lot easier. And that's what I stuck to. I found people that, yes, they're not anthropologists, they're not social scientists. There's only one board member and that is a social scientist, and that's my father. But there are good people with good hearts that have the best interests of the project. And I know that as long as we stick to that, we will, with confidence, develop a plan of action to continue our missions of the project.
What are some periodic requirements that the government places on nonprofits? Like, how many meetings do you have to have per year? And in your meetings, do you have to take minutes?
Yeah. So those would be all established when you develop the bylaws for the project. The meetings are quarterly, and there's always talk about numbers and finances and also any changes to the project. So yes, we do keep track of minutes, which is the responsibility of the secretary on the board. She's responsible for taking down minutes and then disseminating the minutes to all the board members and appropriate people.
Can you give any tips for those wanting to form their own 501c3?
Yeah. So it's the 1023 package. And when filling out this package, and it's almost like writing a mini book, because you're more than just sort of filling out forms, but you'll also have to develop a narrative for the IRS. You have to tell a story. You have to convince the IRS that your nonprofit is worthy of the 501c3 stamp. And that is something that you have to type up and write up. And so really, be as specific as possible in what it is that you want to do in your nonprofit, and just really develop a good narrative, maybe a good 2, 3 pages of material explaining the profit and what it is that you're doing, and how you see the project developing in the future, even though if you don't really know, but vision it, give them a vision. And then the second tip is that have a really good, strong business plan, a budget, and a forecast of expenses, and also how you plan on making more money or developing revenue for your project, and also how you see the budget's expenses and revenue, how you forecast that within the next few years. So that's really important. Those were the two big things that really stuck out in my mind when working with the lawyers and developing the 1023 package, is developing a good narrative and then developing a sound budget.
From what you're saying, a big key to success would be creating a great application package for the IRS, including information that's compelling and well thought out. So did you have any problems or confusion with the fact that there are both federal and state application levels?
Well, the quick process is first you want to incorporate your brand. At the state level, we registered the Good Project as a nonprofit organization, and we had our articles of incorporation and our bylaws, and that is sort of the beginning steps. And you can be a nonprofit and not have the 501c3 tax exempt status, but unfortunately, most people won't engage with a nonprofit that doesn't have that 501c3, especially for tax purposes.
Sure, especially at the end of the year, there are these people that want to donate to a worthy cause. And if you're representing something noble that they believe in, the tax-exempt status is very powerful. And David, I saw that there's a donate button on your website for anyone who wants to make a tax-deductible contribution. Can you give us that website address?
Yeah, the website is www.jointhegoodproject.com. And you can support our mission, our goals by donating, which is now tax deductible, or you could purchase our T-shirts if you like one on our website too. And we are working on some other projects, and hopefully to come out within the next year or so. And if you want to inquire more specifically about what it is that we are trying to do and are going to do, you could always contact us through the website.
And by the way, any money that's donated isn't just going to the Yanomami. I believe that you're also working with another tribe in Costa Rica called the Cabakar. Am I correct? How do you pronounce that?
The Gabekad, yeah, that's correct. Shortly after I had returned, I had gone on an expedition on a whim in Costa Rica, and I found myself staying among the country's most remote tribe, which is the Cabecad. They live in the highlands of the mountains in the Talamanca mountain region. And while they're a little bit further along the acculturation process than the Yanomami, I still found similarities between the Cabecad and Yanomami in a sense where they are so in tune with their environment, and they are so remote and so isolated that they have similar qualities in terms of how they interact and the engagement on a human level. And so I've been working with the Cabecad under the guidance of another nonprofit down there called Bosque Clama. So they're the ones that are helping me establish what I want to do in helping the Cabecad, and then and also in developing projects with the Yanomami.